Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to chat with you about execution leadership. It is one of my favorite things that I do, and I work with a lot of clients and organizations who everyone needs this function of execution leadership, and they use it all the time. And so it's been really great to see a lot of the same patterns and behaviors across the organizations that we work with. So excited to chat with you all about today and looking forward to learning from you all as well. As we all know, we all need to move work forward. So everything that we share here today is going to be hopefully helpful, but also would love to hear from you, best practices from you, and how you keep your work moving forward too. So a few things to get started. Housekeeping items here. This session is recorded, and we're going to share out slides in the recording afterwards. Please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the webinar. Drop your questions in the Q&A as they come up. Also, feel free to continue to share your thoughts in the chat as well. This is really going to be a space for us over the next hour or so to interact and learn from each other. Okay, so a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We are talking about execution leadership and why it matters. And then we're going to move into some practical behaviors that we often see that keeps work moving across organizations. And then we're going to have some time at the end for Q&A. All right, just a little bit of background on Potrero Group. We are a firm that works across the country providing leadership consulting to nonprofits and mission-driven organizations. We help with strategic planning, with facilitation, board development, board searches, and executive recruitment. It's really the full spectrum of organizational leadership support. And so in our work, we work with all these great organizations and we work with these visionary, strategic leaders all the time. And it's really wonderful. But there's always this kind of next thing, this next question that happens, which is how do we actually get this work done when these leaders create this vision and set a direction? So a lot of times organizations in this mission-driven space have shared authority. We have roles that overlap. Strategy and execution can drift apart from each other. And there is a gap between you actually make a decision, you set a direction, and then actually being able to deliver it. And that's where a lot of the organizational energy gets lost. So today, we're going to talk about execution leadership. And this is really focused for those of you who are functional leaders, who are senior staff, those of you who work with those visionary leaders and are responsible for turning vision into action for getting the work done. So it's not going to be necessarily project management tactics, but the actual leadership behaviors required to translate that direction into movement. And I just want to give a little bit of background on me and where I'm coming from and why I'm so excited to talk about this topic, because I've seen in my career that execution leadership is really applicable across all sectors and industries. I spent 8 years in the Navy as a surface warfare officer. I led teams of about 15 to 60 people, depending on my job, in their daily routines. And then I also served as officer of the deck, which meant that I was responsible for driving the ship and managing the ship driving team, which was usually about 5 to 7 people. So a couple of pictures here. This is me on the bridge. This is me up here, very, very tiny. This is where I spent a lot of time ship driving. And then this was my first bridge team down here. This ship environment was, it's the military. You had very clear authority, but you still depended on a lot of people in different rank structures in order to get things done. And so that means that you were responsible for a lot of outcomes that you couldn't completely control. So in this environment, you really learn fast how do you create clarity, how do you coordinate across functions, and how do you keep things moving, because that was essential to getting the mission accomplished. And then later in my Navy career, I served as the Women and Special Operations Program Manager at the Navy SEAL headquarters. So I was responsible for integrating women into that training pipeline. And that was very much a different environment for my ship life. That was much more relationship driven. I learned that getting things done, keeping work moving, relied just as much on credibility and influence as it did on formal authority. So I learned a lot about execution leadership during my time in the Navy. I'm lucky enough to be in a position now where I can apply them in a different mission-driven space, working with organizations, many of them nonprofits, who also use execution leadership to function. So I've been at Potrero Group for 3 years now. I mostly work as a strategist and a project manager on strategic planning, board development, and post-decision implementation. So I spend a lot of time with senior staff, with deputies, with project leads, the people actually turning decisions into action. So what we're going to share today comes directly from those patterns that we see across that work. All right, so let me ground this in a definition. Mission-driven organizations tend to be really strong on vision and strategy. Usually there's no issue there. The problem sometimes crops up, though, in sustaining that organizational momentum once that direction is set. And that movement requires the specific type of leadership, what we like to call execution leadership. And that is the discipline of translating direction into action. It's less visible than setting the initial direction or strategy, but it really is determined what makes those ambitious plans actually happen. And so this type of leadership can show up through pretty specific behaviors. For example, a couple things come to mind. We reduce ambiguity when decisions aren't clear. We clarify who owns what when authority is distributed. We design work so it can actually move forward. We can anticipate dependencies before they become bottlenecks, or people are confused or scrambling last minute. And then lastly, my favorite one is constantly connecting operational decisions back to strategic intent. These are not flashy things, but they really are the backbone of organizational momentum. So before we go further, I just want to be a little bit clear about the scope of this session because execution leadership is a huge umbrella and there's a lot of things that we can talk about. At the organizational level, execution depends a lot on these big structural things. Depends on talent strategy, technology, the operating models of your organizations, the decision architecture, how resources are allocated. And this is for good reason because there really is good research out there showing that when these pieces are not aligned, execution is going to struggle no matter how hard people work. The session today is not going to be about redesigning your operating model. I don't think that we're going to be able to get that done in the next hour, but it's going to be about something more immediate, execution leadership as an interpersonal discipline. Because even inside these systems, whether they are perfect or imperfect, momentum is still shaped about how individuals show up. It's about how they clarify, how they influence across boundaries, how they connect people and priorities, how they move decisions forward. So these are the behaviors that most of us actually control day to day. So that's where we're going to spend our time today. All right, so let's ground ourselves in the reality that a lot of leaders are operating in. There are three big constraints that we'll talk about that makes this execution leadership, this work that we're doing, really hard. Those are distributed authority, the fact that roles are not cleanly separated, and fragile momentum. All right, so first let's talk about distributed or shared authority. So this is what I was kind of talking about before, where even when you're accountable for outcomes, you're usually working across teams, whether that's boards, executives, cross-functional partners, implementation teams. So that means that you don't control every lever, but the work still needs to move forward. And it's usually on you to make sure that the work is moving forward. And you cannot just wait for everyone to be in sync 100% of the time because that would take 100 years and it's just not possible. So work has to continue to move forward even when stakeholders have these competing priorities, different timelines, or only partial buy-in. So execution leadership in this context means learning to create momentum without having full control. You're coordinating across groups, you're keeping people aligned enough to move forward, you're navigating that progress even when that authority is shared. All right, the second thing that makes this work really hard is that roles are rarely cleanly separated. Strategic and operational decisions definitely blur together. Strategy does not just live at the top. And honestly, it shouldn't just live at the top. It's good that it shows up in daily operational decisions. It should really flow down throughout your whole organization. But this also means that something like a staffing change or a timeline shift is going to quietly alter that strategic direction without anyone really even recognizing it or naming it. And Another thing that happens here is that decisions often don't happen in one clear moment. So pieces of a decision often get made across multiple conversations, like in a group of meetings or emails or conversations over time. So there's not clearly a single point of ownership where next steps can fully get locked in. And so this means that ownership and those next steps can easily stay ambiguous, again, without anyone really even recognizing it. So execution leadership in this context means that you have to constantly protect strategy and name ownership of who is moving those pieces forward. And the third constraint that we'll talk about is that momentum is fragile. And this is pretty true in the fact that we don't typically see work stall because people disagree. At the end of the day, the organizations that we work with, people have pretty good alignment at the end of the day. It's just work tends to stall when what comes next is not clear. So it's one of those scenarios when responsibility is spread across the group without landing anywhere specific, where everyone is sort of responsible, so actually no one feels fully accountable. And those next steps are not named. Another thing that happens here is that momentum can also dissolve between meetings. And it's not because people don't care, but it's because the execution system or structure doesn't hold that clarity in place. So execution leadership looks like holding that structure in place so work can move forward. All right, so these three constraints tend to lead to some failure modes when you're trying to get things done. We see these same failure modes show up again and again. These are very consistent patterns. Things like meetings generate alignment, but nobody is walking away with clear actions. Decisions are made in principle and everyone seems aligned, but then the next steps for those decisions are undefined. And then also, again, that distributed responsibility is creating accountability gaps. And we also see sometimes that strategy stays at that leadership level while execution happens in isolation. And over time, that means that strategy is going to drift through these accumulated small decisions that nobody is examining against that original intent, that original strategy. So execution leadership is the practice of interrupting these patterns early and consistently. All right, I've been talking for a minute here, so I just want to pause, take a breath. Let's do a quick reflection here because I'm thinking that maybe what we're talking about today is not particularly abstract. You're likely seeing some sort of version of this in your own work. We all do, Potrero Group does as well. So I just want to take a second and think, where does work most often lose momentum in your world, in your organization, in your space? Is it lack of clarity? Is it lack of follow through? Are there too many voices? Is it not enough structure? So I'm actually going to be quiet for about 30 seconds or so. Feel free to drop a word or a phrase in the chat, and we'll talk about it. I'm seeing too many voices, not enough structure, poor role definition, lack of clarity regarding new strategy or strategy shift, stalled decision making, not knowing what to do next. Yep, absolutely. Lack of understanding on interdependency, distributed decision making. Yes. Overly ambitious, absolutely, versus the reality of being able to get something done. Funding. Yes. Uncomfortable with ambiguity, competing priorities, too many voices, not enough capacity to do the work. Absolutely. That happens all the time, mission-driven organizations. All right, thank you all. I appreciate you coming along with me there. I just want to say everything that you're naming is exactly where execution leadership lives. It's in these kind of everyday places where work is either going to stall or we can create some momentum to keep it going. No one willing to take the lead. Thank you, Brenda. Yep, that's a great point. That shows up often. All right. So For this next part, I just want to warn you all, I'm going to be talking for quite a bit. We're going to do another reflection like this at the end, but I just want to encourage everyone for this next bit where I'm going to be sharing a lot of info. Just keep sharing your thoughts in the chat if you'd like to. Keep asking questions if you have any. We want to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and best practices on how you keep your work moving forward. Again, execution leadership is this big umbrella. There's a lot of things that fall under it. We're not going to address everything today, so would love to keep hearing that you're all best practices and keeping work moving forward as well. All right, so what does effective execution leadership actually look like in practice? As I said, there's a lot of answers to this. And across our work, we've seen these strong execution leaders tend to operate actually through a pretty consistent set of behaviors. And this by no means encompasses all the great behaviors of execution leaders, but we're going to try to capture some of them today. We've organized these into 4 execution leadership pillars. And within these, we're going to give more practical behaviors to explain them a bit more through 10 specific practices. And I know these are numbered here. I just want to say these are not sequential steps, but they're more ongoing ways of how leaders show up to keep work moving. And the last caveat I'm going to say is that you may be looking at these today and be like, these are not revolutionary. These are not novel ideas. And that's true. We're not going to be rebuilding the playbook here today. We're going to be talking about things that we see all the time. These are behaviors that we see in leaders that consistently get things done. What's rare is that they're all in one person in one place happening at the same time. Okay, the first pillar that we're going to dive into is creating clarity. The reason we start here is very simple. Nothing moves without clarity. As I'm sure you all know, ambiguity is going to cost time, it's going to cost momentum, it's going to cost alignment. And in complex organizations with that distributed authority and a lot of decisions that need to move forward, that is going to compound really quickly and get really expensive. So someone has to surface when things are unclear. That doesn't just resolve itself. And when I talk about creating clarity, I don't mean having all the answers. I mean reducing ambiguity about what decision we're making, what problem we're solving, and who owns what next. Specifically, this is about creating clarity in the moment. All right, so one way that leaders create clarity is just by asking a clarifying question, which makes sense, but being able to ask it early. This seems really basic, but it is so useful. And most of the time, this is really straightforward. It's questions like, this is what I'm hearing. Is that accurate? Or are we deciding something here? Or are we still exploring? Or what problem are we actually trying to solve? These are not fancy questions, but they can really change the trajectory of a conversation. And sometimes it may feel a little bit uncomfortable to ask them, especially if everyone seems aligned on the surface. But more often than not, I'm sure everyone's experienced this at some point. Someone else was wondering the same thing and is glad that you said it. Another move that helps a lot to create that clarity in the moment is naming the next decision before the meeting actually ends. So, to be clear, you might not be making that decision in the moment, but calling it out keeps ambiguity at bay. So, let's say you're in a board meeting discussing strategic priorities. You might say something like, so, what I'm hearing, what it sounds like is the next decision is whether to pursue the partnership. The next thing we'll need to do is to get the finance committee's input before that happens. Does everyone agree? Am I hearing that right? So, all of this, asking these questions can help prevent drift. It's going to save you time later. It creates shared understanding before people start moving in all these different directions after the touch point because there was ambiguity and no one had just asked the question to clear it up. Another practice to create clarity in the moment is to make ownership explicit. A lot of work doesn't stall because people disagree. Again, we chatted about this before. It stalls because everyone else assumes that someone else is handling it. And if ownership is clearly named or not clearly named, things are going to slip through the cracks really easily. So, to share a moment that we all may have seen, a meeting ends with the great sentence of, "Good conversation, everyone." And yeah, great. We may have all aligned on something. It may have been a great conversation, but no one is following up to say who owns what happens next, or when it's due. So before conversations end, execution leaders ask a few questions like who owns the next step, by when, and what does done actually look like? Again, simple example, this can come up in everyday moments. You may just hear something in a meeting that kind of sounds like a next step, but is not really defined. Like someone might say, maybe we could reach out to that foundation and get their input. And in kind of, instead of just letting that hang in the air and rest in that ambiguity, ownership sounds like stepping in to say something like, just to confirm, Grace, I'm understanding that you'll reach out to that foundation by next Tuesday and share back at our next check-in. Do I have that right? Again, these first couple of practices sound pretty basic, but these small moments can make a big difference. It's going to keep momentum from fading because you're closing loops in the moment. You're replacing assumptions with clarity, so you don't need to revisit that same conversation later. All right, moving on to our second pillar, reducing cognitive load. A lot of leadership at this execution leadership level is about making it easier for others to engage, make decisions, and move forward. And the biggest way this shows up is how you bring things forward. So execution leaders don't just escalate problems, they escalate judgment. They bring perspective into the room, not just the issue. This is probably one of my favorite practices here, bringing judgment forward. This looks like instead of bringing something forward and asking, what should we do? You may say something else like, I've been looking at this. Here's how I'm thinking about it. Or here are three options I see, and here's where I'm leaning. So let's just say, for example, you're managing an executive search and a candidate drops out. And instead of just flagging the problem and escalating the situation to inform people about it, you escalate judgment instead. And you might say something like, this candidate withdrew, but I've already reached out to our second choice who's still interested. I recommend we move forward with them because they meet our priority criteria and we're up against a timeline. Does that approach work, or do you want to revisit the pool? This type of escalation of judgment builds trust because people can see that you're not just passing the work upward, you're actually engaging with it. And that does a couple things. It speeds up decisions because the conversation can start at that level of trade-offs and directions, not just informing and orientation. And over time, this really strengthens your own judgment and strategic decision-making muscle as well. So you get faster at seeing the patterns, the risks, the implications, because you're taking ownership of the thinking, you're practicing the thinking instead of just outsourcing it. And this also creates better mentorship moments, which is my favorite part about it. So when you bring your perspective and then ask, here's how I'm seeing it, how would you push on it? You're inviting someone, usually it's someone more experienced, to refine your thinking, not just replace it. So that's a much more productive leadership loop because you learn faster and they engage more meaningfully. And then lastly, this also takes the workload off of others too, because senior leaders don't have to start from zero every time something comes up. They can step into the part of the conversation where their experience actually adds value. And that leads us perfectly into our next practice, which is very similar, which is leading upward with precision. As we all know, senior leaders have limited time and attention, and when you bring them everything, it's harder for them to see where they're most useful. So precision and knowing what value is needed in the moment changes that. So let's say, for instance, you're preparing board materials, and instead of just sharing the deck and saying, can you review this deck or this document? You might say instead, I need your eyes on the financial projections on slides 8 through 10 and whether the framing on slide 3 positions are asked clearly enough for this board. That is very precise. It's very pointed. And that means that you're directing their attention towards the decisions that matter. This helps leaders engage where they add the most value. It keeps the oops, sorry about that. This helps leaders, they're engaging where they add the most value. It keeps the pace of the work moving, and it also signals ownership. The same thing that we just talked about with escalating judgment, where you're not handing something off, you're moving it forward and inviting that targeted input. All right, the third pillar here, designing for momentum. This is what I like to call the engine room of execution leadership, because at some point, execution cannot just rely on individual effort alone. It's going to also depend on how the work itself is set up to move. And structure is what allows work to move without people getting lost, confused, or stuck waiting for the direction. So, the first practice we'll talk about within this pillar is designing the room for decisions. Momentum is heavily shaped by who is in the room for decisions. And we really see this a lot in our work with mission-driven organizations because there may be a bias in this space for consensus-based decision making, getting everyone's perspective before making a decision, really having that inclusive decision-making model like that. And that is super well intentioned. And sometimes it really can be the right method in many situations. But at the same time, that also results in decisions not getting made or they move very, very slowly. So, execution leadership means you're intentional about actually who needs to be a part of a decision versus whose perspective would be helpful to inform it. And those are different things. You can absolutely gather broad input, and you often should through surveys, conversations, whatever method you need to get that broad perspective. But decision conversations move more effectively when they involve the people actually responsible for acting on them. So let's say, for example, you're developing a strategic plan. You might gather input from staff, board members, community partners through surveys and focus groups, but the actual decision, finalizing priorities, really may just come down to the executive director and a few select board members. I would say we like about 2 to 5 people in a decision group. But of course, that depends on the scale and circumstance of the initiative or the decision. But usually it is quite a small group at the end of the day who's going to be the final decision makers. When everyone is in the room for a decision, the conversations get longer, accountability blurs, and movement can slow. And honestly, it is a little bit about respecting roles as well. People are in certain seats for a reason. And when we design decision groups with intention, we're letting the right people do the job they were hired to do. And we're getting that final decision with the right people in the right seats. Rich asked a good question here. I'm just going to pause. Rich asked how to handle leaders who just want to review it all and put it in their own words. That is a great question. And this is what it comes down to as well in terms of reading the room and knowing the leaders that you work for. These are really good broad practices, no matter the environment that you're working in. But of course, it also depends on circumstance and who you're working for and learning what they like. That's part of the interpersonal discipline of execution leadership as well. I would say to this, start small. I would continue to say, this is something that I recommend, or this is something that I see. Again, it doesn't need to be pushy. You don't need to go through an entire document and change everything, but just point out a few things there. Um, and you may be surprised on what they think that their value is coming in there. And then you may just work with those leaders who are like, you know what, I'm just going to rewrite the whole document. And that's how it is. The way I would say, you deal with that is just learn from what they did. Look at what they did and see where can I learn from this and what can I put into my next product that I like that they did. But feel free. I mean, again, if anyone else has other perspectives, definitely feel free to jump in. All right, practice 6 here. Using structure to stay oriented. Okay, this is the practice that I would say is most like the project management tactics. This is where the classic execution toolkit comes in. So timelines, project management tools, checklists, dashboards. So far, we've been talking about some interpersonal relational behaviors like asking questions, clarifying ownership, escalating judgment. This is one of the few practices where we will actually talk about the systems and tools, the good classic project management. So project management like Asana, Monday, Smartsheet. My favorite, which is just a shared Google Doc with a timeline, things like process maps, status trackers, visual dashboards. None of this is groundbreaking. Most people don't get excited about Gantt charts or things like that, but they are super important. And here's what we see happen a lot. Most organizations build these tools with really good intentions, and then we see them get abandoned after a few weeks. Let's say there's a timeline that gets created at the beginning of the project or the program, and then no one looks at it again. Or the project tracker is just sitting in someone's Google Drive. And people stop updating it because either we're all in meetings and we all know what's going on anyway, or more often than not, it's not a priority and everyone else is just busy. But what we've seen a lot is that execution fails when these tools are created and just not actively used, and people think that they can do it all through good conversations. Momentum is not going to sustain itself through memory and good intentions. It really needs that structural scaffolding. And execution leaders are the ones who own keeping these tools alive. So bring that timeline into every meeting, pull up the tracker, walk through it, reference where things are in the process, reference it out loud, make visible what's happening and what's next. So for example, you're running a strategic planning process. You might start each meeting by pulling up the timeline and just right off the bat saying, we're in week 3 of stakeholder input. The draft is due in 2 weeks, and the board review happens in the first week of next month. So everyone is aligned. And that visibility is great. It keeps, that ambiguity is not going to keep creeping back in there. It helps people stay connected to the work without needing to reorient all the time. Again, momentum is not relying on people to remember everything. The system is actually going to carry the weight. And then it helps you stay organized as well. It helps you stay on top of the work as it moves, especially, as we all know, multiple priorities are competing for your attention, and you can't just hold everything in your head all the time. One of the most practical execution habits is just building time into your week to think about the work. So even 10 or 15 minutes on the calendar to step back and look at a project or initiative or program, even when you don't think you have anything to do on it right now. So you're not doing the work in this time, you're just thinking about it. You're thinking about what's coming next, who will we need, what might slow this down, what happens after this step, things like that. And this is a small habit, but it has a really big impact because you'd be surprised how often that short 10 to 15-minute window is going to surface another move that you just didn't think about before. Could be an email to a potential funder before the proposal is due, or you're scheduling a conversation with someone just to get their perspective on something. Things like that are what keep a project or an initiative moving before the urgency kicks in. My colleague likes to call this one getting on the balcony because what you're doing is you're giving yourself the space to get out of the daily details of it and the immediate tasks of it, and you're just looking at the overall flow of the work. And that's going to save you and others eventually from having to react unnecessarily later. So, in the beginning, when we talked about creating clarity, we talked about how to create clarity in the moment. This one, closing loops relentlessly, is more about the follow through discipline that happens between those formal touch points. So we talked about clarifying decisions in meetings and confirming ownership before they end. This is what happens after. So this looks like things as simple as sending a recap email with clear next steps and owners. That's one of my favorite things. Or following up when a deadline is getting close to pass. And you're not doing this in a nagging way, you're just doing a quick check. Hey, I just wanted to make sure this didn't fall off your radar. You're also checking in between meetings when you know someone is working on something really complex and just offering your support. In these mission-driven organizations that we work in, everyone's juggling multiple priorities. Everyone's thinking about a million different things. It's this steady communication that keeps work from slipping in between those quiet but really crucial moments between touch points. So it reinforces accountability without being heavy-handed. It maintains momentum across those gaps. And also, it's going to build trust in you as well, build trust in you and your process that things are not just going to disappear. The last pillar we're going to talk about today is about anchoring execution to strategy. So, strategy and execution can drift away from each other through, again, small decisions, trade-offs, priorities that feel really practical and maybe even really small in the moment, but maybe pulling you or your organization away from the original purpose or intent of the strategy. So this pillar is all about keeping the day-to-day work connected to the bigger direction by constantly asking, are we still pointed where we said we were going? Execution leaders are the ones who protect the strategy in small moments to make the work actually move. So again, strategy is going to drift through reasonable, practical decisions, slowly pull the organization's attention elsewhere. And this happens all the time. Maybe there was a new project that gets added that wasn't a part of the stated priorities. Meeting agenda shift from strategic goals to urgent operational issues. Resources are getting redirected without anyone naming the trade-off. And especially in mission-driven organizations, stuff like this can happen constantly because there's always more need than capacity, or new urgencies are going to come up last minute. So execution leadership sounds like naming this, actually owning this when you recognize the strategy drift come up. Saying things like, is this aligned with the priority that we set? Or if we take this on, what are we deprioritizing? Does this move us toward the goal, or does it just feel productive? For example, your strategic plan prioritizes fundraising growth, but the team keeps getting pulled into program expansion. Execution leadership is noticing that and naming it. Or if, the board has committed to governance improvements, but every meeting is still becoming about these operational updates instead, someone has to pull it back. Someone has to name it and say, what was our goal? What was our intent with this? And this is where execution and strategy really meet each other. We talked about how those two things overlap with each other. You in this position, you're not just getting things done, you're ensuring the work stays pointed towards what the organization said mattered most. And what that does at the end of the day as well is it also elevates your own execution work into strategic leadership. All right, this last one is about leadership presence in the room. So most of us work in environments where there's constant discussion, constant input, constant ideas. Execution leaders tend to be really intentional about where they step in. They pick their moments and they don't have to weigh in on everything. And this isn't to say that you don't speak up. You definitely do speak up, but you pick your moments. So of course, a moment that might make sense is you're commenting on something that is going to affect execution, of course. So a trade-off isn't being named, or this happens a lot when something sounds really good in theory, but is not going to work in practice. So let's say your board is really excited about launching this new program on this aggressive timeline. You're the one who knows the operations team is already at capacity. So maybe you, again, depending on your situation and your dynamics, you speak up and you say, I just want to make sure we can do this really well. Given our current commitments, we'd either need to extend the timeline or deprioritize something else. How should we think about this? So, that's an execution example, but using your voice intentionally is also for shaping strategy as well. Again, thinking about that strategy execution overlap that we love, because people in these execution roles can really internalize that their job is just, I just get things done, or, I just need to stay in my lane. And they self-silence on these strategic questions because they think that's not my job. And that really is a huge loss for organizations because In reality, a lot of times execution leaders are the ones who see that strategic drift first. You noticed those daily decisions are pulling away from the priorities because you're the one in the weeds. You see what actually works and doesn't work across initiatives. So often, strategic questions actually are the execution questions. An example here, the strategic consideration of adding a second major program area, being able to voice the consideration of, are we becoming a multi-issue organization? Or are we staying, are we focused on our core mission and this is just complementary work? Those types of questions and considerations directly impact your ability to execute well and the organization's ability to pull it off. At the end of the day, it is strategy, though. And you are the right person to ask it. And again, it's not despite your execution role, but actually because of it, because you know what it takes to do multiple things well. So being able to work in that shared overlapping space of execution and strategy is what separates execution leaders from project managers. And over time, using your voice intentionally is going to create real leadership presence for you, because that means when you engage, people are going to listen because they know it matters. All right, I am going to stop talking for a little bit and just say we covered a lot. There's 4 pillars, 10 practices. We've seen execution leadership can show up in a lot of ways. It's interpersonal, it's behavioral, it's structural, depends on your circumstance. And we only covered some of those ways today. There's a lot more out there. So before we close and go to a Q&A, I just want you to think about your next few weeks and do another reflection with me, if you will. So, not necessarily thinking about your long-term goals, but just the real work in front of you the next few weeks. What is one place that you could apply one of these behaviors immediately? Maybe it's clarifying ownership before meeting ends, bringing judgment forward instead of just questions. You're using your timeline more actively. You're speaking up when you notice direction drifting. You're closing loops more consistently, things like that. So again, I'll be quiet for a couple seconds here. Feel free to drop one thing in the chat. What is one thing you'll try this week? Carve out time to be on the balcony. That's one of my favorites. Redoing trackers to be better tools. Quick check-in on projects. Absolutely the trade-off there. If we take this on, what are we deprioritizing? The balcony. The balcony is a great one. It's a sleeper, but it's so effective. Clarifying ownership. Brenda, good point. You could get on the balcony to even think about what tools are going to create structure. Continually using project tracker in meetings. Great. If anyone would like to share out loud of anything that they're thinking about a little bit more, intensely about their work next week or any behavior that they want to try, we want to hear it. Feel free to come off mute or raise your hand. No pressure though. Karen says, bring an ad hoc project I'm tasked with in line with strategy. That's great. That overlap there. All right. Well, thank you everyone for that reflection. We are going to move it into Q&A, and we're going to stop the recording soon. Before I do, I just want to introduce our next webinar. We do these free webinars once a month. The next one is on leadership transitions, a search committee's playbook. That's going to be on Wednesday, March 25th. And you can see a poll just popped up here too. Please feel free to answer that as well. That helps us improve and get better. So this next webinar is really for folks who are on search committees. It'll be on, or will be on search committees thinking about executive transition. So we're going to walk through a playbook to how to run an effective search process, and that's going to be with Andy Leiter, one of Potrero Group's managing directors. He has led numerous outstanding and successful searches and is a real whiz at this. So if you're navigating a transition or if you're thinking about one, this one is definitely worth attending. And also feel free to stay in touch with us. Some of you might be brand new to Potrero Group, some of you might be old friends, but we encourage you, sign up for our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn. There's more stuff like this always coming your way. All right. I'm going to end the recording now, but I'm happy to open it up to you to take questions with the time we have left if anyone has anything on your mind.